The desert sun had already begun to bleach the color from her lips when Thomas Rourke found her, half buried in red dust at the edge of the Cimarron Trail. One arm curled protectively around a baby that had stopped crying hours before he ever arrived. If she had died there, alone, no one would have known her name. If the story moves something in you, if you still believe that kindness can save a life, that faith can carry a person through the darkest desert, and that broken people deserve second chances, I ask you now, before the story goes any further, to like this video, leave a comment, share it with someone who needs a little hope today, and subscribe to this channel. Costs nothing, and it means everything to storytellers like me who believe these old frontier tales still have something to teach us. The year was 1878, and the Kansas plains stretched out beneath a sky so wide it seemed to swallow a man whole. Thomas Rourke was 34 years old, a cattleman by trade, though fortune had never much favored him. He had buried a wife 3 winters back, taken by fever, and buried with her most of his reasons for smiling. He drove his wagon alone that autumn, hauling salted meat and dry goods between Abilene and the smaller settlements scattered like seeds across the territory, a solitary figure against a horizon that never seemed to end. He was not a religious man in the way preachers wanted him to be, but he still prayed sometimes, quiet words spoken to the wind when the loneliness pressed too hard against his chest. It was on the 3rd day out from Abilene, with the heat shimmering off the flatlands and his horses growing weary, that he saw what looked at first like a heap of discarded cloth near the trail's edge. He might have ridden past it, as men sometimes do when they are tired and wanting only their supper and their bedroll, but something in him, some old instinct he could not name, made him pull the wagon to a stop. When he climbed down and walked closer, his breath caught hard in his throat, for it was not cloth at all, but a woman, young, maybe 22 years, her dress torn and stained with blood that had long since dried black, and pressed against her body, wrapped in a threadbare shawl, was an infant no older than a few months. He knelt beside her, certain she was already gone, and it was only when he touched her wrist and felt the faintest flutter beneath the skin that hope flared up in him like a struck match. Her name, he would later learn, was Sarah Whitfield, though in that moment she was only a stranger clinging to life by a thread thinner than spider silk. The baby, a girl, whimpered weakly when he lifted her, and that small sound was enough to set his hands moving with a purpose he had not felt in years. He carried them both to his wagon, laid them upon the bedroll meant for himself, and gave the woman water from his canteen, drop by careful drop, praying she would not choke, praying harder still that she would live. There was no town near enough to reach before nightfall, and so Thomas made camp right there beside the trail, building a fire against the coming cold and sitting watch over the woman and child through the long hours of darkness. He did not sleep. He watched the rise and fall of her chest as though his own life depended upon it, and somewhere near midnight, when the coyotes called from the distant hills, she stirred and opened her eyes, wild with fear, and tried to pull away from him before her strength gave out entirely. He spoke to her gently, the way a man might speak to a spooked horse, telling her she was safe now, that no harm would come to her or her baby while he drew breath. It took her a long while to believe him, but eventually her body relaxed, and she wept, silent tears sliding down dust-caked cheeks, and Thomas found that he was blinking back tears of his own. By the time the sun rose, casting long gold light across the prairie grass, Sarah had found enough strength to speak in broken fragments. She told him her husband had been a miner who died in a collapse outside a camp in the Colorado hills, and that soon after his death, a man who claimed to be settling her husband's debts had come to her cabin, taken what little she owned, and when she resisted, had beaten her and left her for dead upon the trail, taking her horse and leaving her to whatever fate the wilderness intended. She had walked for 2 days with the baby before her legs would carry her no further, and she had lain down in that dust believing she would never rise again. Thomas listened to every word without interruption, his jaw tightening with a quiet fury he had not felt since the day his own wife passed, and when she finished, he made her a promise that surprised even himself, that he would see her safely to wherever she wished to go, and that no one would touch her or the child again while he was near. They traveled together after that, slow days across the Kansas plains, the wagon wheels creaking over dry earth, the baby, whom Sarah had named Grace, growing stronger with each passing mile as Thomas shared what provisions he carried and hunted rabbit and quail along the way. In the evenings, They sat together by the campfire, the flames throwing dancing shadows against the wagon's canvas, and slowly, carefully, like two wounded animals learning to trust again, they began to talk. Sarah spoke of her childhood in Missouri, of a father who farmed corn and a mother who sang hymns while she worked, and Thomas spoke of his late wife, of the ranch he still tended alone, of the silence that had filled his house since her passing, a silence he had learned to live inside but never learned to love. There was a tenderness growing between them that neither dared name, born not of romance but of shared suffering. The kind of bond that forms between two people who have each stared into the same abyss and found their way back. But the frontier was never a place that let peace linger long. On the fifth day, as they approached the outskirts of a small settlement called Willow Creek, they found the town in a state of quiet dread, its dusty main street unusually empty, its shopkeepers peering out from behind half-closed shutters. Thomas soon learned why. A man named Silas Grady, a hired gun with a reputation that stretched from the Texas Panhandle to the Nebraska Territory, had ridden into town 3 days prior asking after a woman and child, offering money to any man who could tell him where they'd gone. It did not take Sarah long to recognize the description, and the color drained from her face as though someone had opened a vein. Grady was the man who had left her for dead, and he had not given up the hunt, for reasons Sarah herself did not fully understand, though she suspected it had something to do with a debt her late husband had supposedly owed to men far more dangerous than a common thief. Thomas felt the old fear return to Sarah's eyes, the same fear he had seen the night he found her, and something hardened in him then, some resolve that had been sleeping since his wife's death. He walked into the town's small sheriff's office, a weathered wooden building with a tin star nailed crookedly above the door, and spoke with the lawman there, a graying man named Sheriff Elias Boone, who listened with grim attention as Thomas laid out what he knew. Boone confirmed that Grady had indeed been asking around, and worse, that he'd been seen just that morning riding toward the very trail Thomas and Sarah had come in on, meaning their paths were likely to cross again, and soon. That night, camped just beyond the edge of Willow Creek, Thomas made his decision. He would not run from Grady, for running would only mean living in fear forever, glancing over their shoulders at every rustle of wind through the grass. Instead, he would stand and face what came, not out of pride, but because he had made a promise, and a man who breaks his promises is no man at all. Sarah begged him not to risk his life for her and the child, told him she could not bear to be the cause of another death, but Thomas took her hands in his, rough and calloused from years of ranch work, and told her that some things were worth standing for, that he had spent 3 years being a shadow of a man, drifting through his own life without purpose, and that finding her on that trail had given him something he thought he'd lost forever, a reason to fight. Grady arrived just before dawn, his horse's hooves kicking up dust as he rode into the small camp with 2 other men flanking him, their faces hard and unreadable in the gray morning light. Thomas stood between them and the wagon where Sarah huddled with baby Grace pressed to her chest, his rifle steady in his hands despite the pounding of his heart. Grady's voice was cold as he demanded the woman be handed over, claiming she carried something that belonged to him, though Thomas suspected the truth was simpler and uglier, that Grady could not abide the thought of a witness to his cruelty surviving to tell the tale. Thomas told him plainly that the woman belonged to no man, that she was free, and that if Grady wanted her, he would have to go through him first. What followed was a tense and terrible standoff, the kind the old frontier was known for, where words hung heavy in the morning air and every man's hand hovered near his weapon. It was Sheriff Boone, alerted by a townsperson who had seen the riders pass through, who arrived just as tensions reached their breaking point, backed by 2 deputized ranch hands from Willow Creek who had heard enough of Grady's reputation to want him gone from their territory for good. Outnumbered and outmaneuvered, Grady's bravado cracked, and in the chaos of the moment, as he reached for his pistol in a final desperate act, it was Boone's steady aim that ended the threat before it could claim another victim, the sound of the shot rolling out across the empty plains like distant thunder. Grady's companions, seeing their leader fall, fled without another word, disappearing into the vast emptiness of the territory, never to trouble Willow Creek again. In the silence that followed, Sarah collapsed to her knees in the dust, clutching Grace to her chest, sobbing not from grief but from a relief so profound it felt like drowning. Thomas knelt beside her, wrapping his arms around them both, and for the first time since he had found her on that lonely trail, He allowed himself to believe that perhaps some wounds could heal, that perhaps the desert that had nearly taken her life could also be the place where a new one began. Sheriff Boone, wiping the dust from his brow, told them quietly that Willow Creek could always use good folks, that there was land not far outside town going for a fair price, land with good water and grazing enough for a modest herd. And he looked at Thomas with the knowing eyes of a man who had seen many hardships in his years wearing that tin star, understanding that sometimes the frontier gave back what it took, if a person was patient enough and brave enough to wait for it. Before I tell you how their story ends, I want to ask something of you, dear friend watching this. Wherever you are in this wide world tonight, whether you are watching from a quiet farmhouse, a city apartment, or somewhere in between, I would love for you to leave a comment below telling me where you are watching from and what lesson this story stirred in your heart. Was it the power of kindness shown to a stranger? Was it the courage to stand for someone even at great risk? Was it the truth that broken people can still build something beautiful together? I read every comment, and your words mean more to this small channel than you could know. The months that followed were not easy ones, for healing rarely comes swift or simple, but they came steadily, like spring after a hard winter. Thomas used what savings he had to purchase the land Sheriff Boone had spoken of, a modest stretch of prairie with a creek running through it and enough grass to sustain a small herd of cattle, and he built a cabin there with his own 2 hands, working from sunrise to sunset while Sarah tended to Grace and slowly began to remember what it felt like to smile without fear shadowing the edges of it. The townsfolk of Willow Creek, having heard the story of what happened on that dusty morning, welcomed them both with a warmth that surprised Sarah after so much cruelty had touched her life, bringing quilts and preserves and offers of help raising the barn. For that was the way of frontier communities, bound together by hardship and faith in equal measure. There was a Sunday, some 8 months after Thomas had first found her in the dust, when the small church in Willow Creek stood filled with townspeople gathered to witness Thomas Rourke and Sarah Whitfield exchange vows before God and community both. Sarah wore a simple dress sewn by the hands of women who had become like sisters to her, and baby Grace, now walking on unsteady legs, toddled between the pews drawing laughter from the gathered guests. Thomas stood at the altar with his hat in his hands and his heart in his throat, and when Sarah walked toward him, he thought of that morning on the trail, of the woman he had believed dead, and marveled at the strange and sacred way that suffering, when met with courage and kindness, could transform into something as pure and lasting as this. Years later, when Grace had grown into a young girl who rode horses across the prairie with a wildness that made her mother's heart leap into her throat, Thomas would sometimes tell her the story of how he found her, though he always softened the darker edges for her young ears, focusing instead on the courage of her mother, on the mercy of God, on the strange grace, fittingly named, that had brought them all together. Sarah never forgot the terror of that trail, but she learned that terror need not define the whole of a life, that a person left for dead could rise again if someone was willing to reach down and offer a hand. And Thomas, who had once believed his capacity for love had been buried alongside his first wife, discovered that the heart is a strange and resilient thing, capable of breaking and mending and breaking again, and loving fuller each time it heals. The ranch they built together grew steadily over the years, becoming known throughout the territory not just for the quality of its cattle, but for the kindness of the family who ran it, a family who never turned away a traveler in need of water or a meal, remembering always the mercy that had been shown to them when they had nothing left to offer the world but their survival. Sheriff Boone remained a dear friend until his own passing many years later, and it was said that at his funeral, more than half the county turned out to honor a man who had spent his life protecting the vulnerable, a debt Thomas and Sarah felt they could never fully repay, though they tried, in every kindness they extended to others, in every stranger they welcomed onto their land. If this story touched your heart even a little, if you believe, as I do, that kindness shown to a stranger can echo across a lifetime, that faith can carry us through our darkest hours, and that even in a hard and unforgiving world there is room for second chances and redemption, then please, before you go, take a moment to like this video, leave a comment sharing your thoughts, share it with someone who might need this story today, and subscribe so you never miss the next tale from the Old West. These stories live on because people like you choose to carry them forward, and for that, I am more grateful than words can truly say. And so the wagon that once carried a dying woman and a silent, fragile child across the endless Kansas plains became, in time, a symbol the family kept always near their home, a weathered reminder of the morning when a lonely cowboy chose compassion over indifference, when a desperate woman found in him not another threat but a refuge, and when a helpless infant grew up beneath a sky that had once nearly witnessed her death, now blessed instead to witness a lifetime of love, laughter, and unbreakable family bonds beneath the wide and watchful heavens of the American frontier.